that she'd wept tears of relieved gratitude when she'd been offered a position as her silly cousin's lady's companion. Before, Artemis would have fallen upon this grim harlequin with cries of thanks for having rescued them in the nick of time. Now, Artemis narrowed her eyes at the masked man and wondered why he'd come to the aid of two lone women wandering the dangerous streets of St. Giles at midnight. She winced. Perhaps she had grown a trifle cynical. He strode to her in 2 lithe steps and stood over her. She saw those intense eyes move from the hand on her pathetic knife to her face. His wide mouth twitched. In amusement? Irritation? Pity? She doubted the last, but she simply couldn't tell. And bizarrely, she wanted to. It mattered somehow what this stranger thought of her, and, of course, what he intended to do to her. Holding her gaze, he sheathed his short sword and pulled the gauntlet off his left hand with his teeth. He held out his bare hand to her. She glanced at the proffered hand, noticing the dull glint of gold on the smallest finger, before laying her palm in his. His hand was hot as he gripped her tightly and pulled her upright before him. She was so close that if she leaned forward a couple of inches, she could have brushed her lips across his throat. She watched the pulse of his blood beat there, strong and sure, before she lifted her gaze. His head was cocked almost as if he were examining her, searching for something in her face. She drew in a breath, opening her mouth to ask a question, which was when Penelope launched herself at the harlequin's back. Penelope screamed, obviously nearly out of her mind with fear, as she beat uselessly at the harlequin's broad shoulders. He reacted, of course. He turned, yanking his hand from Artemis's fingers as he lifted one arm to push Penelope aside. But Artemis tightened her hand on his. It was instinct, for she certainly wouldn't have tried to hold him back otherwise. As his fingers left hers, something fell into her palm. Then he was shoving Penelope aside and loping swiftly down the lane. Penelope panted, her hair half down, a scratch across her lovely face. "He might have killed us." "What?" Artemis asked, tearing her gaze away from the end of the lane where the masked man had disappeared. "That was the ghost of St. Giles," Penelope said. "Didn't you recognize him? They say he's a ravisher of maidens and a cold-blooded murderer." "He was rather helpful for a cold-blooded murderer," Artemis said as she bent to lift the lantern. She'd set it down when the toughs had appeared at the end of the alley. Fortunately, it had survived the fight without being knocked over. She was surprised to see that the lantern's light wavered. Her hand was shaking. She drew in a calming breath. Nerves wouldn't get them out of St. Giles alive. She glanced up to see Penelope pouting. "But you were very brave to defend me," Artemis added hastily. Penelope brightened. "I wasn't I? I fought off a terrible rogue. That's much better than drinking a cup of gin at midnight in St. Giles. I'm sure Lord Featherstone will be very impressed." Artemis rolled her eyes as she turned swiftly back the way they'd come. Lord Featherstone was, at the moment, her least favourite person in the world. A silly society gadfly. It was he who had teased Penelope into accepting a mad wager to come into St. Giles at midnight, buy a tin cup of gin, and drink it. They'd nearly been killed, or worse, because of Lord Featherstone. And they still weren't out of St. Giles yet. If only Penelope weren't so set on becoming daring, loathsome word, in order to attract the attention of a certain duke, she might not have fallen for Lord Featherstone's ridiculous dare. Artemis shook her head and kept a wary eye out as she hurried out of the alley and into one of the myriad of narrow lanes that wound through St. Giles. The channel running down the middle of the lane was clogged with something noxious, and she made sure not to look as she trotted by. Penelope had quieted, following almost docilely. A stooped, shadowy figure came out of one of the sagging buildings. Artemis stiffened, preparing to run, but the man or woman scurried away at the sight of them. Still, she didn't relax.